Hi, so I just want to introduce myself quickly. My name is Leah Marsh, and I am a current master's student at the University of Delaware in the 4+1 Fashion and Apparel Studies program. And right now I'm interning with Dr. Liu, working for Cotton Incorporated. And I just want to acknowledge that program, their curricular program, and this interview will serve as an open education resource for other fashion programs sourcing classes. And so now I would like to introduce and welcome Julia Hughes, the president of the US Fashion Industry Association.
Thank you, Leah. I'm so happy to join you today.
Thank you. So yeah, we can just jump right into the
Okay.
questions. And I guess to start, could you just provide a brief introduction to USFIA and such as your mission, your members, etc.?
Thanks. And again, I'm so glad to join you all today. So the U.S. Fashion Industry Association, right, not to go too far into the deep history, but the association was founded back in 1989 with the mission to eliminate the global quota system. Now, those of you students at University of Delaware and other schools have probably studied this as history for the textile and apparel industry. But it was a very important mission at that time, and I think really reflects some of the mission of the association today. So at that time, we definitely had one major goal on the world stage, but also found that what companies, brands, and retailers were looking for is sources of information, opportunities for education. So how could they meet decision makers, or industry analysts and experts in different areas. And that's something that associations do, for all kinds of sectors, not just the fashion industry, but bring together government officials and other experts through webinars and especially through in-person meetings to have a chance to really hear for yourself what's going on and what are the issues ahead. And then the last thing that associations do, and there are thousands of associations here in Washington, D.C., is advocacy. So how can we take what are the concerns and the issues most important to our members and talk with government officials, whether it's the executive branch, Congress, or also the embassies on the international scale with what are the major issues, what are our concerns, and what are solutions that we think would benefit the industry as a whole. So that's kind of a brief introduction to kind of what associations do generally, but also the mission for us.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the USFIA sounds very important, especially in the educational realm, just providing resources and information to students like me. So when I visit the USFIA website, I come across the statement, fashion made possible by global trade. And so how can we interpret or understand the global nature of today's fashion industry?
So if I was doing my normal spiel, right, so that's one of the most important things that we have to say about our association, because yes, our members are US based brands and retailers. We also have associate members who are service providers and international companies who might have subscriptions to our information, but we represent American US based companies, brands, and retailers. But in the political realm, and again, we're headquartered here in Washington, D.C., often the discussion about trade quickly devolves to a discussion about, well, why can't we make it all in the United States? And looking at the world through a more limited view than I think fashion brands and retailers and fashion students are going to. So that's where, talking about, well, how can we communicate this? We thought that a great brief phrase that communicates that is fashion made possible by global trade. And that allows us to talk about the global value chain and the many interrelationships that we have with many jobs here in the US that you might not think about or that you would know about, but that policymakers might not think about, that are in product development or design, or behind the scenes logistics, down to the store level. That happens here in the U.S. with manufacturing happening predominantly overseas. The numbers vary, but definitely more than 90% of apparel is made outside the United States. So clearly, and where apparel is made is not necessarily where the yarn is spun or where the fabric is made. It's not necessarily where the goods are packaged to ship to the US for sale. Then you have all of the logistics and supply chain issues. So we thought, not to get too excited about it, but I love that phrase because it kind of encompasses a lot of what our industry does, and the fact that we work with suppliers in Europe, in Asia, in Central America, and Latin America, all over the world. And I think that's so important to communicate as we talk about what are the key issues for brands and retailers.
Yes, definitely.
So I'm glad you noticed that on our website.
Yes, it was very prominent. But also, as you just mentioned, we know that a lot of clothing we see in retail stores is coming from outside of the US, from all over the world. US fashion companies, especially large ones, typically source from more than 10 or even 20 countries. So, what are the main factors driving US fashion companies' sourcing diversification strategies today?
Well, and let me just say it's an interesting dynamic. And as you know, in coordination with Dr. Sheng Lu, USFIA has done a benchmarking study, 10 studies now, kind of looking at the ebb and flow of diversification versus consolidation within the industry, right? So there's kind of different pressures. But diversification remains a key goal for many companies because the world is unpredictable. So we may not have predicted, COVID, or the supply chain disruptions that were going to happen then. There might be an earthquake that disrupts your supply chain. And if that's the only place where you are manufacturing your product, you're not going to get your product. There might be global risk or unrest. So I think it's a smart strategy. And I will say, kind of looking at the history and the key issues for this industry, in a sense, the quota system prepared sourcing executives for this, and that tradition lives in companies, even though people who are doing sourcing today weren't sourcing then, because most companies had to diversify, and so those relationships and partnerships with manufacturers around the world have existed, and that remains I think it's part of the success for our industry, unlike some other sectors where they have consolidated in just one country or one region. We have that ability to be nimble and to move quickly for sourcing if we have to respond to an issue.
Yes, exactly. Just like with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
So also trade statistics suggest that Asia has been a leading apparel sourcing destination for most US fashion brands and retailers for decades now. Why is that? And then also, do you expect this pattern to change in the next few years?
Yeah. It's really interesting because China has been the largest supplier for a long time, but it's really Asia writ large. It's not just China that is the core for the industry. And I think part of that builds on the relationships that have been built, and the skill sets, as well as the ease of working together. So again, most companies have had years of doing business with the same suppliers, and how to work together, and what their capabilities are and how they treat their workforce and what their factories look like. Because you're auditing and you're in their factories all the time. So I think that helps to explain some of the strength in Asia. It's interesting, though. I was talking with one of our members earlier yesterday, who was saying that, as they look at their sourcing, they look at the strengths in certain industries. So some countries tend to have better supply chains for knits. Some do more cotton than they do synthetics. And Asia's still the top suppliers there. So it's China and it's Vietnam and Bangladesh and Indonesia. and India, they all have many different companies and many different strengths, so that you can develop that. You can have an office that is not just focused on, you're not just making t-shirts in a country, you're able to do the full range of different types of products in one country. And that helps with your supply chain and with your, behind the scenes costs of doing business. So I think Asia is going to remain strong, but there still is the other trend, which is we're looking for more diversification, and that means looking at where are there opportunities outside of Asia to make sure that if there's some kind of a disruption, that you're going to have Western Hemisphere supply chains as well. Or, especially I think looking at Turkey is an example of a country that to the US market is not a top supplier, but is to the European Union. And so that there's more opportunities to go outside of Asia, but Asia is going, I think, to remain the largest region for supply for the foreseeable future.
Yes. Yeah. Dr. Lowe and I are working on a current study, and it just shows that Asian countries really specialize in product assortment diversity, but not really product sophistication. So that is also a notable pattern there. And then
Exactly.
also I just
I'm glad that I align with your findings in your study. Good.
Yes, yeah. And then also I just read the 2023 fashion industry benchmarking study released by the USFIA, which highlighted US fashion companies' increasing commitment to sustainable and responsible sourcing. So can you provide us just with some additional insights and updates from interacting with your members?
Sure. And this is one of those areas that's so hard to talk about because there's so much to say, and there are so many ways to define what is sustainable sourcing and what is responsible sourcing, right? So, it's for some companies, some of this discussion can be framed by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and I encourage folks to look back at them, because that is kind of an overarching way to look at some of these issues. But for our sector, what is it that we're really involved in? I mean, there are initiatives, and we at USFIA, we try to engage with many of the players and the active groups, whether it's on the fiber side, right? So for cotton, for example, I mean, what the U.S. cotton industry is doing with Cotton Incorporated, the U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol, for tree-based, for viscose and rayon, canopy, the types of initiatives that look at, all right, where's the fiber come from, and how can we be sustainable with the fiber development, as well as how can we be more sustainable in the manufacturing processes. We're particularly interested in, like right now, I think focused on circularity as one of those areas that maybe is poised. I hope we're on the cusp of more opportunities for circularity, because it's hard. And certainly it has been eye-opening for me to hear about how difficult it is, right? We may donate our clothes and we may think that we're putting it in the chain for recycled, but it's very difficult then to manage. How do we manage that? How do we turn it into fibers again that can be used to make product, whether it's you take your water bottle, or whether it's you take your t-shirt. So I think that's a key area, especially for us. But then there's also this is the problem with talking about this. There's so much. So, how do we reduce greenhouse gases? That's a big issue. How do we become more energy efficient at the retail store level or at the distribution center level? That is really another way to really be more sustainable in the long run. How do we deal with water? We have a number of members who are very focused on some of the water initiatives. How can we maintain clean water and make sure that the dyes that are used we're not creating health risks for the workers or downstream for what goes into the water. So I think this is an area that there's already so much to talk about, but it's certainly a focus for the future, and for how can companies engage in this, and not just the big companies. but I want to note, especially for students, as you're thinking about your careers, you may not be working for the largest company in the world. You may be working for a smaller company. So what are some of the initiatives and ways that in our everyday lives, and even in a smaller company where you're not driving a policy decision, that you can have more sustainable sourcing, sales, and a more sustainable company?
Hmm. And in addition to companies, do you think consumers are aware of these topics, such as reducing greenhouse gases, water initiatives, and circularity, just in the context of the fashion industry, or not really?
I mean, I do think some people are. I mean, but I think, not as many. And then also, like,
Hmm.
how to participate in it. And I think that's the hard part. I went to an event here in DC that was at National Geographic, where they were talking about, like, how do we deal with the textile waste issue, right? So how do you make it easy for people how do you make it easy to get textile waste, and what do you do with it when you get it? And one of the waste management companies was saying, like, this is the problem. Even if we gather it, how do we sort it, and how do we get it to the right people in order to move forward? But I think more consumers they're paying attention to it. They see the ad campaigns, they see the hang tags talking about when a garment is more sustainable. But now we still have a lot of education to go, and we still have solutions that we need to develop as well.
Hmm. And luckily, resources like this will help provide information and education to more consumers.
Yeah.
So, moving on to a new topic, in the news, we've learned about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was newly implemented in 2022 and is directly related to cotton specifically. So, how has the UFLPA affected the sourcing practices of US fashion companies? And what notable observations have you noticed?
Sure. And, I'm going to go back even a little bit further than that. When the first reports came out about the situation in Xinjiang and the treatment of the Uyghurs, I will say that as an industry, brands and retailers came together, and with other industry associations, we actually started talking about solutions to this issue early on, actually, all the way back in 2019, long before the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was in Congress and passed by Congress. And that was because there's no brand or retailer that I've ever met that wants forced labor in their supply chain. So, step one was for most companies to say, we want to eliminate Xinjiang from our supply chain. How do we do that?
Hmm.
It was easy. The easy part is to say, well, I'm not making clothes there. This kind of leads to the whole discussion about traceability that I think is so important. And one of the key issues for us right now is how to guarantee traceability in your supply chain, and how to guarantee what one of our partners calls sustained compliance. So the ability to make sure that there, whether it's forced labor or child labor or unsafe conditions, that none of that is in your supply chain. So anyway, back to your question. So we started, before the legislation, actually, to look at, all right, how can we help companies, and who are service providers out there who might be able to help companies with their traceability, with knowing the web of relationships among suppliers, and where might there be links to Xinjiang. And so this has been a multi-year effort. There were withhold release orders, so there were already restrictions on imports prior to the legislation going through. And I think the legislation, though, is valuable in many ways. And I wanted to say that we were not opposed to the legislation, and indeed, brands and retailers spoke with Congress about the legislation to help them understand how sourcing works and what could be successful in terms of understanding when there is a risk in the supply chain. But obviously, once the legislation went into effect, we have some frustration that there isn't more transparency. There aren't more, companies. Like, if customs knows who a bad guy is, why aren't they on the list, so that we can be sure that we're not doing business with them or with their subsidiaries, for example. But companies have been working hard on making sure that they comply. As associations, we try to share those concerns with the government officials on how to do better, right? How might there be improvements in the targeting and to make sure that goods aren't just stopped because there's a innuendo, but they're based on real risk-based targeting. And I think that's where we're moving to. Companies have left Xinjiang. For some companies, they've left China because the risk of how can you prove the negative that no cotton from Xinjiang got into your supply chain? Even those who are using US cotton or Brazilian cotton or Indian cotton still might run into those issues when they're dealing with imports into the US and CBP taking a look at how do you prove what's in your supply chain. So there absolutely have been risks and shifts in the supply chain. And I think they're going to continue as companies are looking at it. It's not just cotton out of China, right? There are other products that are being looked at and that are being stopped and analyzed for a link to either Xinjiang physically or to Uyghur workers who may have been shifted to other parts of the country. So that it remains a top concern for us and something that we're spending a lot of time on, and how can we help our members ensure that they are compliant.
Yes, thank you. And then also, are there other major apparel sourcing key issues or trends that our students could pay attention to right now?
Well, I think, one of the interesting things working in this industry, because fashion is made possible by global trade, means that you have to pay attention to the whole world around you. And I think that's so important, whether you have the opportunity to travel to see what it's like outside the United States, or whether you're just looking at what might be trends today. And I'm thinking particularly like global risk, that you need to, it's really important from a company perspective, because there is not a lot of predictability in the world where there might be, for example, there was a press story today about factories in Bangladesh getting a recommendation from their local association to close for some days because of protests in the lead up to their election in January. So you need to be aware of that. And so if the world is unpredictable, you can't know, where there might be, where a war might break out, or where disease might break out, or where there might be an election that has global risk. So you want to have as much predictability as possible in your own business dealings that you can find. So I don't want to say like, oh, there's just one thing to watch for, but whether it's climate issues and what's going to happen in terms of new reporting requirements in the EU and the US on forced labor and your supply chain, you kind of need to be like following what's happening in the world all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And currently, we're all aware of the Israel and Palestine conflict. Has the USFIA noticed any effect on that thus far recently?
I have not heard from any members. I mean, that's a great question. I have not heard from any members that they have found issues, but of course, everything is disrupted, and our hearts go out to everyone in Israel for the horrible events of October 7th. And what we're seeing every day in terms of any war and the impact on civilians, both in Gaza and in Israel, is horrifying. So, kind of to say that emotionally and from a policy perspective, we're very concerned about that. But I haven't heard yet about supply chain disruptions. So we'll have to see. I think it still is early days. I only have heard so far about travel issues where people may have shifted their travel plans so they weren't going through the Middle East on their way to Asia or on their way to South Asia. But other than that, no direct industry impact yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just wondering how long a global event like that normally takes to impact the industry. But thank you. And then in general, what makes you feel passionate about your role as the USFIA president?
I mean, that's that's a hard question to answer. I mean, I love working with this industry, and my background, I was really very lucky because I was interested in international trade, And I was lucky enough to get a position with a company that was a sourcing company based in New York City as my first job in this industry. And as a Washington, D.C. person, so my job was to share with them what's happening in D.C. so that they could be prepared in case there were disruptions and problems for the company. But I got to meet the design people and the product development folks and travel with them overseas and see what the process is like. And it's kind of so exciting to see how it starts, right? From, a sample or a design sketch, and ends up on a rack in a store for sale. So I just think this is a great industry with, such great people that work in it, and that are so interesting. But again, all over the world, right? So it's not, there are not narrow perspectives. There are many perspectives that you meet. And I love the opportunity to work with the companies and share with them the expertise of what's happening here in DC, and then share with the policymakers what's really happening on the company level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an exciting time for students like me. I have a couple friends who have already started jobs in the industry in both New York and DC. So it's interesting to see that. And then also, obviously, a lot of other current students are interested in pursuing careers in sourcing, trade, and policy aspects of the fashion industry. So overall, do you have any suggestions or advice for them?
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's hard to give advice, right? Because but I guess my biggest advice would be kind of be open to the opportunities. And I use the word serendipity. So it's kind of, you may think that you want to be working for a certain company doing a certain job, but if there is something that opens up for you that is a little bit different than that, be open to looking at other opportunities that may change your career path a bit, but that you can find it are really rewarding. And I think that that's the most important thing. I mean, it's hard looking for jobs. I totally understand that. But just being open to the moment and what are opportunities for you, I think that's always good advice moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah. And a lot of students seek out internships before looking for jobs. Did you have any internship experience before you got your job?
I did. I was an intern on Capitol Hill and I hated it. So,
Oh,
well,
oh,
not I hated it, but I realized that, the politics are difficult and divisive. And, this was
mhm,
long before today where things are really more divisive than they were before. But I strongly recommend internships. There are a lot here in
mhm.
DC, whether with government or with associations particularly. And I highly recommend it if you're interested in the DC side for pursuing that. I know many of our members have internships as well for
Mhm.
students, so that you have a chance to see what it's like inside a company. So I highly
Awesome.
recommend that. And it may be that what you're doing there, you're like, this isn't exactly what I want to do. But that's my
Mhm.
irony, because I didn't really like it, but that is very much a part of what I would do now, is deal with Congress. So you just don't know what path your career might take.
Yeah, and finding out what you don't like as well as do like is a part of the experience as a whole. So,
Absolutely, yes.
yeah. Well, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it, and I know all of our students and fellow classmates will use this resource.
I hope you will, and I look forward to hearing
Mhm.
from you and meeting you in your new careers.
Thank you.
Thank you.